Hello and welcome everybody to a new video of our Freecom tutorial series where we are going to build a fully fledged clone of the intercom support chat. Today's video is all about authentication and permissions. So basically the goal for today is that we want to make sure that a customer can only ever access their own messages. So a customer should only be able to read messages in their own conversations, and also it should only be possible for a customer to create messages in a conversation that they're currently participating in. And the way how we're going to do this is by configuring the permissions in the GraphQL console and then implementing an anonymous authentication provider. So the first thing that we've got to do, we have to go to the GraphQL console and open our Freecom project and then hit the permissions tab right here in the side menu. Permissions in GraphQL work in the way that you have to specify permissions for different operations. So there are 4 different kinds of operations. One operation for reading data, for creating data, updating data, and for deleting data. So these are the 4 kinds of operations that a user can perform on the data that we've stored in the database. Now it might be that you want to restrict the access to perform these operations for a specific audience. And the way how you do this is by specifying the permissions right here in the console. So for each type, we can add these permissions for each operation. And in general, permissions in GraphQL follow a whitelist approach. That means that by default, actually no operation is permitted, so you always have to go and explicitly allow it. However, when you're creating a new type, we are creating these default permissions for you. So despite the fact that you have never actually created any permissions, we were able to previously already create messages and conversations and customers in our backend without actually having created these permissions. So these were the default permissions that were generated for you initially when you created these types. If you were to remove these permissions, then it wouldn't be possible to interact with the backend at all anymore because no operation would actually be allowed. So again, our requirement is that a customer should only be able to read the messages that are written in the conversation where they're participating. So we have to add a restriction on the message type. To add a new permission or to change a permission, we can simply click on the row for that particular operation on the type. And then we'll see a pop-up where we can configure the precise permissions for that particular operation. So here we are changing the read operation on the message type. We first can select which fields this permission should apply to. So here potentially we could specify that this permission should only apply to the text, for example. So right now it applies to the whole model, so to all the fields of that model, but we could also say that we only want the permission to apply to the text field so that all users could still go and access the ID, the created at and the updated at fields, but only the text field is actually part of the permission. But in our case, we actually want to apply the permission to the whole model. So we're going to select everything again. And then we're getting to the part where we have to specify what the permission should look like. So before we actually go into the details about how we can configure the permissions such that they meet our requirements, I just want to quickly demonstrate to you how these permissions work here. So for now, we are simply going to click the authentication required checkbox here and update the permission. With this, we are making sure that only an authenticated user is actually able to read messages from the database. And to prove that to you, I'm actually going to open up a playground and we'll try to read the messages now. And this is going to throw an error stating that we don't have enough permissions to perform this operation. So I'm going to open up a playground right here in my browser by pasting in the HTTP endpoint of the simple API. And right here, we already have a query where we are asking for all the messages. Let's add the text to this query as well. And if I now hit the play button, we indeed see that we're getting this insufficient permissions error stating that we cannot perform this operation at the moment. If I simply remove the check mark again, it'll be possible for us again to perform this operation. If I run the query again, we're now actually getting all the messages. So this is the basic idea of how this authentication field works. But now how can we authenticate a request such that we don't get this insufficient permissions error when we actually have the authentication required checkbox checked? Well, for that we have to use a so-called Authentication Provider. And we have a number of these that we can enable in the Integrations tab right here in the side menu again. At the moment, you've got the choice between 4 different authentication providers. The first one is Auth0, that allows you to integrate with any social login of your choice. So you could choose Google or Facebook or GitHub login. Then we've got Digis, which uses authentication based on your phone number. Then the standard email and password authentication. And then we've got this anonymous auth provider, where we don't require the user to provide any information, but we actually generate the token for a user based on a secret that identifies the user in an application. And because that really is the requirement that we have for the Freecom application, where we don't want the user to provide their email and password in the first place, or to log in using Google or Facebook login before they start chatting with the support agents, we have to use the anonymous authentication provider for our use case. To integrate this anonymous authentication provider, we can simply click on the integration right here. This will bring up the pop-up. And here we can specify which type we want to be able to authenticate in our application. And this is going to be the customer type, because we want the customers to be authenticated. So this is going to generate this mutation that we can use from now on. And this mutation basically allows us to create a new customer based on a secret that we're going to send along. So whenever when we are using this mutation and sending this mutation to the backend, we have to provide some secret that identifies a customer. And this is going to return the authentication token for that customer that we can attach to all subsequent requests. And this token is going to authenticate the user, the customer on the server side. So once we click enable, we've got the, we can use this authentication in the backend in the API. So now the authentication provider is enabled. And if we refresh the page in our playground and check the documentation, we now see that we have this authenticate anonymous customer mutation available in our API. So before we use this new mutation in our code, I want to go through the flow of creating a new customer with this mutation and then making sure that we can actually authenticate ourselves with the token that we receive in return. So let's go ahead and use this mutation in the playground. I'll also increase the font a little bit and make it full screen. So now let's go and use the authenticate anonymous customer mutation. We then also have to provide the secret that is going to uniquely identify the customer that we're about to create. Right now I'm simply going to pass in a random string, and then we're asking for the ID and the token of the new customer in return. So now a new customer was created. So let's actually go ahead to the data browser and see if that's actually true. So let's select the customer type. And here we see that a new customer with that particular secret has been created. And one thing that I didn't mention before, but that's important, is that we provide a default value for the name field for the customer. So I haven't done that in the video, but you actually have to go to the schema view and select the name field of the customer. Because we made it required, it always needs a default value when a new customer is being created. And since we don't have the ability to also pass the name for the new customer in the authenticate anonymous customer mutation, we have to specify this default value right here. Another option would be to make this field optional, but I just went with providing the default value of unknown as the the default value for the name field of the customer. So that's the reason why the new customer that was created has the name specified as unknown. But we can now use this customer to authenticate our calls, or more precisely, we can use this token to authenticate the calls to the API. So if we're going back to the all messages query and send this query again, we still see that we currently have insufficient permissions. So we cannot actually read the messages that we currently have stored in the database. If we want to simulate the authenticated user right here in the console or in the playground, we can use the Chrome console for doing so. Simply by bringing up the console, and in the console, we have to add the token to local storage. So all we have to do is we have to set the token that we received from the API as the value for local storage.token. We hit enter. We refresh the playground. And once the playground is refreshed, we can send the same query again. And this time it's going to return the actual messages. We're now getting to the point where we can integrate the authentication functionality in our code. So for that, you can head over to the GraphQL examples GitHub repository. And from there, we're using the Freecom 04 directory as the starter code for today. So I already downloaded the starter code and have it right here. So today we have to make basically two adjustments. At first, we have to change the way how we are creating a new customer. So rather than using the create customer mutation that we've set up before, we have to use the new authenticate anonymous customer mutation to create a new customer and subsequently initialize the customer with the name and their initial conversation. And then we have to make sure that the token that we receive from that mutation is being used in the configuration of our Apollo client, so that when the Apollo client is sending the HTTP requests to our GraphQL API, it attaches the token to the authorization field of the HTTP requests header. Let's quickly run the application to see what it looks like. So I'm heading over to a terminal and calling yarn start in the frontend directory. And now we can access the application in the browser. So right here, when I'm now sending a message, the message is actually not going to appear on the screen, despite the fact that we integrated subscriptions last time. But the reason for that is the new permission that we configured, and because the request that we're currently sending is not authenticated. So we are not going to see the permission appear on the screen, the message appear on the screen. So we have to make sure that our requests to the backend are authenticated by first authenticating the customer that is sending the requests. So let's go back to the code and start with the adjustments that we have to make. The first thing is that we have to replace the create customer and first conversation mutation right here. So let's go ahead and delete all this code and replace it with the new mutation that we saw in the playground before. Here is what that new mutation looks like. So that's precisely the one that we were using in the playground. It's the authenticate anonymous customer mutation, where we're passing in a secret and we're asking for the ID and the token to receive that from the server once the mutation has been performed. The second mutation that we have to add is to initialize a customer. Because remember, when we had the create customer and first conversation mutation before, we were actually passing in the name of the customer, and we were also creating the first conversation for that customer directly. So what we have to do now is we have to do that in two distinct steps. The first one is to create the customer, and then the second one is to initialize the customer with the name and the first conversation right here. So that's what we are doing in the initialize customer mutation. And now we have to go and replace the create customer and first conversation mutation from before with the create authenticated customer mutation. And then we have to add the second mutation to the compose call, which was the initialize customer mutation, so that we have access to that in the props of the app component. The next step now is to update the implementation of the setup new customer method right here. So first we're going to delete the current contents, and then we have to perform the two mutations that we just added to the app component. So at first, the authentication part. Here we are first generating a secret from the CUID function. So that's a new dependency that we added to the project, and that's contained in the starter code already. We imported it up here. So this is going to be to generate a random string, a random ID for that new customer. We're then saving that secret in local storage. And then we're actually going to perform the create authenticated customer mutation and passing that secret as a variable to that mutation. From the result that is being returned by the server, we're retrieving the token as well as the ID, and also storing both in local storage. The next step then is the initialization of the new customer. So here we have to go and use the second mutation. First, we generate the username for that customer, and then we are calling the initialize customer mutation, passing along the username that we generated, and to identify the customer that we want to update, we're also passing the customer ID that we received from the previous mutation, and then storing the customer name in local storage as well once this is done. So the last step is to update the state of the app component once this mutation has been performed. And this is basically the same code that we had before. We initialize the conversations with the first conversation that we received. And we also select the conversation for the customer right away so that they don't have to do that themselves. We now have to make sure that this authentication token that we receive is attached to all the subsequent API requests that the Apollo client is executing. For that, we have to go into index.js and adjust the configuration of the network interface that we're using to instantiate the Apollo client. And really, all we have to do is to add a middleware to that network interface, where we are first creating the headers object on the request if it doesn't exist yet. And then we're retrieving the token that we previously stored in local storage. We're retrieving it from local storage and attaching it to the authorization field of the new header. And this code is basically taken directly like this from the Apollo documentation. So it's really the standard implementation of how you would use the authorization header with the Apollo client. We're not quite done with the authentication step yet, because we also have to authenticate our WebSocket client, the subscription client that we instantiate up here, so that the WebSocket connection that we have with the backend where the subscriptions are provided is also authenticated. For that, we have to add a new argument to the constructor of the subscription client, and that's the connection params. And here we can pass an authentication token as well. And like with the middleware and the authorization request header, we can retrieve the authentication token from local storage again. And this way we make sure that our WebSocket connection is also authenticated. Before we can go to test this implementation, we actually have to do two more things. The first one is to fix a little bug that I introduced when I was showing you the implementation of the app.js file. So let's head over there again, opening app.js. And we actually have to adjust the payload of the initialized customer mutation. If you recall the payload from the mutation that we were using to create the customer before, it was actually pretty huge and looked like this. So we have to use the same payload on the update customer mutation that we previously used when we created the customer. And then down in the setup new customer method, we also have to adjust the part how we retrieve the information from the response that was returned by the server. So here we are not using the create customer, but rather the update customer field on the data object that's being returned by the server. The second thing that we have to do is to head over to the constants.js file and switch the test with new customer flag, to true. And this will make sure that every time we run the application, that all the data from local storage is going to be deleted, and the application will think that we're a completely new customer, thus creating a new customer for us in the backend and authenticating us. Let's now test the app by heading over to a terminal and calling yarn start. This is going to start the app and open up the browser. So here we are in a new chat window for the current customer. And if we are now going to send a message, it's actually going to appear on the screen. We're still not quite done with our implementation. In fact, we now are done with the setup in the front end. So we make sure that we are authenticating the user with every request. However, in the backend, we haven't quite fulfilled the initial requirement that we had that users can only access their own messages. In fact, what we have at the moment is the requirement that only authenticated users can access messages. But this means that once a user is authenticated, they can still go and access all the other messages as well. So now we have to make sure that a user can actually only read their own messages. And the way how we do this is by specifying a permissions query in the GraphQL console. So let's head over to the console again and open the permissions tab in the side menu. So now we actually have a more concrete requirement than simply the fact that a user has to be authenticated. And whenever we're in that kind of situation, we have to use a permission query that allows us to really precisely express the permission requirements that we have for a particular operation. And in our case, we have the requirement that only the user the customer who participates in a conversation should be able to read these messages. In general, a permission query works in the way that it is going to return true or false based on the information on the filter that is being provided. The permission query is going to be executed right before the operation is going to be performed. So let's assume that a user wants to read a particular message. That message will be identified by the ID that is being passed into the query right here. So this node ID represents the message that is about to be read. Now we can specify the filter. And at the moment, really, the filter only asks if if a message with this particular ID exists. So we can assume that that's going to return true for all the messages that are supposed to be read in the database. But now we want to have an additional requirement where this message should be in a conversation that is associated with the currently authenticated user. And the way how we can do this is by first adding the user ID as an argument to the query. And we can do that by simply clicking on the user ID right here. So now we have access to the ID of the currently authenticated user inside the permission query, and we can express our requirement by extending the filter. So here we are on the message type. So a message is associated with a conversation, and the conversation is associated with a customer. And now we require that this customer is the same as the currently authenticated user. So we're passing in the user ID, or we're filtering for customers with the user ID that is being passed into the query right here that identifies our user. Now when we update the permission, we're actually done with all the requirements. In the application, we won't see any changes, so we're still able to perform to write messages right here. But we now also have this requirement established on the backend side that only a user that is currently participating in a conversation is actually able to read the messages from this conversation. And to be complete, we also have to add this permission query to all the other operations. So I'm going to do that real quick. I'll add it to one more operation, and then I'll leave the rest as an exercise to you. So again, for the create operation, we're specifying the rules. We have to add the permission query. We're toggling the user ID, and we're using the exact same permission query that we used for the read operation. That was it for today's Freecom chapter. I really hope you enjoyed learning about authentication and permissions with GraphQL, and I hope to see you next time again.